Hi, Tony Fry. Another video. Today is going to be about war. Just a little bit of background. I was born in war. Bomb sites were my adventure playground. I served as a soldier. I've worked in post-conflict environments in a few countries, and I've written on war. So war is something that I have a certain familiarity with. More significantly, the context in which we now live is becoming increasingly dangerous. Geopolitically, over the last decade, global tensions have increased. The global world order is starting to fragment, and that means the relation of power, particularly between East and West, has shifted. Along with this, climate change has arrived as a far more significant factor in determining the future. And as we'll see a little bit later, there's a direct relation between climate change and conflict. So that's really where we're starting from. Now, the image of war is something that we've all become familiar with, but there is a really significant difference between the reality of war and how we have imagined it. And a part of that imagination, has really been determined for a great number of people by the entertainment media. So the image just does not correspond with the reality. What is not obvious to most people is the invisibility of war. So the dramatic, the visible, is familiar. The invisibility is the unknown. And the invisibility, it is really everything that goes to creating the the moment of action. The technologies, the planning, the intelligence, the organisational structures, the logistics, all of those things are just as much a part of war as the moment of action. War is not something that remains the same. Over the 20th and 21st century, war has dramatically changed and is becoming more and more complex. Again, that adds to the disparity between what we think war is and what war actually is, and the fact that war is not one thing. War is still a conventional battle, but war is also something that happens in cyberspace. War is still conventional, but it is also asymmetrical, which means it is waged by insurgents in nations where the distinction between the combatant and the civilian has disappeared, where the difference between the rules of war and rules without war has disappeared. So this is a little bit of the complexity that we're dealing with. And equally, the sound of war has changed. War would mostly be thought to be a huge, violent sound of destruction. But it is equally now silent. The noise of war can overwhelm every atom in the human body, but equally war is silent. One of the phenomena of war is boredom rather than action. In a conventional war, a huge amount of time is spent waiting for something to happen, rather the moment of violence. War, in a sense, now has no other. Traditionally, we think that there's a clear distinction between war and peace. But in the contemporary environment, in the complexity of war, that really has dissolved. So we can have, on the one hand, kind of friendly and economic relations with a nation, but that nation, at the same time, is quietly waging war against us, both in terms of the activity of spying and all the kind of intelligence that goes along with gaining an advantage in conflict, and equally the whole cyber dimension of undermining the activity of another nation by intervening in all the kinds of ways that are now emerging, from electoral intervention to the disruption of economic systems. So war, rather than just being seen as a binary, war and peace, it now exists in multitudes of gradations and levels. War now has no gender. In the past, in the developed nations, war was predominantly a male domain. Women came in to provide supplementary services, but now women are combatants alongside men, which has been the case in other parts of the world for a long time. Wars no longer have a badge, which is to say they are not kind of recognisable by a declaration that identifies who a soldier is and who is not. As I've already said, because of the rise of asymmetrical war, war no longer is simply defined in terms of conduct by rules. They still apply in some contexts, they don't in another. They become blurred. And one of the mechanisms in many armies that blur that is the kind of the use of special forces. So there's a direct correlation between the rise of insurgents and informal structures and the use of special forces, particularly in engaging those combatants. Another thing that's changed is the division between war and peace at the level of the beginning of a war and the end of a war. Again, that has become very blurred. The conflict trickles on long after the major conflict dimensions have occurred, and wars are things that, in the current situation, nations slide into rather than declared. There is no formally declared war in the world at the moment. The US has been fighting in Afghanistan for well over a decade, but that was never a war that was declared. So I'm really just reinforcing what I've been saying about complexity. And let's just think a little bit about war and destruction. Obviously, we're very familiar with the devastation that war wreaks upon cities, but it obviously still wreaks devastation upon bodies. But at the same time, that in turn is incredibly damaging to families. It is also damaging to minds. But it also, and this is a kind of another kind of level, it is also destroying the future. Wars increasingly have an environmental impact. There is nothing more destructive, really, than war in terms of the speed of destruction. But in a sense, they continually destroy us. We have the idea that over the millennia we have developed. But in a way we haven't, and the evidence of that is war. Certainly they've become more sophisticated, but we haven't. The technology has changed, but in many fundamental ways we haven't. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus famously remarked that war is the father of all, the king of all. He renders some gods, others men. He makes some free, others slaves. In a sense, that still is held in place. It is an omnipresent event. The event is never over. The consequences always run on. It is a shadow that we live in. It is part of our concern, our insecurity about the future. And as I've been saying, that insecurity is actually increasing. In a sense, it has been made out of reach. Almost everybody feels helpless in the face of an escalation towards war. And in a sense, technology is always here in relation to conflict as a condition of limitation. A limitation in our overcoming war. Our ability, in other words, to get rid of the means by which war is waged is absolutely hopeless. We are incredibly bad at disarming. So war really never sets anything free. Now to say a little bit about design. This is a kind of a spectrum, a snapshot. There are basically two kinds of wars. There are major wars and small wars. There are also conventional wars and nuclear wars. As I've said, there are asymmetrical wars with insurgencies. There are civil wars. There are wars within states. There are urban warfares, and that is becoming increasing a concern and a worry. As more and more megacities arrive, the expectation is in the future there are going to be really significant wars in megacities. And nobody knows how to deal with that. Obviously, there's been a mention of cyber wars, and they link to a wider electronic dimension of warfare. But war also takes place on a psychological level. And coming back to the lack of distinction between war and peace, they are now thought of in certain ways as unrestricted. In other words, war is conducted not just in the terms of violence in a normal way, but economically, culturally, politically, and as I've said, psychologically. So nations really are kind of waging war across the entire range of government and state activities. So there's one last kind of dimension of all of this, which has been again a continuum, which one would have expected to be transcended as civilizations have become more sophisticated, but they haven't. We still have wars between factions within cultures. Race has been turned into a domain, as always, of conflict, as have religions. So again, there is this contradiction between the new and the traditional, between habit and innovation. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about, in a sense, the presence of the invisible structures of war of our day and age. And that goes to the enormous sophistication of the technologies that are employed. And I'm going to use the triangulation of targets as the example. This is a very sophisticated design phenomenon. It's based upon 3 places in the world. In Australia, in the Central Desert, a place called Pine Gap. In the US, Buckley Air Force Base in Denver, Colorado. And in the UK, Menwith Hall in Yorkshire. Now what those 3 places do is to provide the electronic means to locate through triangulation any target anywhere in the world and provide the guidance system that will take a missile, a cruise missile, or a large intercontinental ballistic missile to its target. At the same time, they are deeply implicated in the mechanism of surveillance. They can identify a particular person with a particular mobile telephone anywhere on the planet, whether that telephone is turned on or turned off, if they have the kind of preceding intelligence to allow them to do that. So these are, as I've just said, technically very sophisticated design systems that equally provide the guidance system to the weapons that I've indicated. In other words, they allow any target to be struck anywhere at any time. They are in operation 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year. The system is never switched off. They manifest the phenomena of war being a perpetual condition. They are active in some way all the time. Now, another dimension, another part of the indistinction between war and peace, the massive domain of the arms industry, as it is part of the economy, as it is part of the structure of the function of a nation. For example, it represents a huge amount of the economy of the USA, and in terms of the global arms industry, the United States provides 36% of all the arms produced in the world. Russia 21%, France 7.9%, Germany 5.8%, China 5.5%. So this is a huge industry. And it creates what President Eisenhower called shortly after the Second World War the military-industrial complex. So that it presents at one level a very kind of clear delineation between the economy of war and the economy of peace. But in fact, it becomes very blurred when you start to think about the technology. Is a computer an object of war, an object of peace? Well, of course, it can be either. It can be part of a weapon system or not. So, again, the notion of what a weapon is has become blurred. And in terms of insurgencies, we're all now very familiar with that. A petrol tanker can be made an object of war. Simply a vehicle driving down the street has been made an object of war. So there is, again, I'm just emphasising continually this indistinct relation between war and peace. So, in relation to how this has a perspective in terms of how we think about design, if you go into a museum, if you go into an art school, if you undertake a course in design, what I've been talking about in almost all cases is completely absent. So on the one hand, kind of war represents a huge domain of design activity that is invisible from the way in which design is thought and taught. And that actually reflects a very significant kind of limitation in terms of how design is thought in general, because so much of the world that is designed is absent from the discourse and the education of design. So I want to just talk about just three particular examples of design technology on war that are going to become increasingly more significant over time. Drones. We're all familiar with drones. We are aware that drones can be minute, they can be the size of insects, but equally they can be the size of small passenger aircraft. What I'm really pointing to is that they've only been around for a few years, and they are going to be increasingly developed and increasingly prevalent. And along with the other second dimension, which is autonomous weapons. In other words, weapons that are not directed by human intervention, but are guided by artificial intelligence systems, and in a sense act simply from the feedback that they gain in an autonomous sense. Obviously, drones and autonomous weapons overlap. There are drones that have the ability to identify and destroy a target without having any direction from a human agent. So this is kind of throwing up two things which are of enormous significance. One is the ethical question, and there is ethical concern about these weapons, but the development of the weapons is well in advance of the debate over the ethics. The other dimension, which again once was the stuff of science fictions, is no longer fictional. It is the prospect of simply a battle being able to conducted purely by machines. And then the other thing that is of great concern is the shift to the possibility of nuclear weapons being increasingly close to being used in war. And this results from the arrival of tactical nuclear weapons, weapons that are simply used at a battlefield level. And as, to go back to what I said at the beginning, the world geopolitically becomes more dangerous. A part of that danger is a greater likelihood of the use of tactical nuclear weapons if there is a major conflict in the next few decades. Okay, one last observation in relation to design. One of the things that has happened as a result of the conflicts in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and prior to that in the insurgencies in Israel, is the development of a military design movement. Now, what really resulted from the really kind of the imbalance and the disparity of form of contact in an insurgencies was that it was discovered that conventional ways of fighting just didn't work. That the weapons that were available were very inappropriate for working in urban environments. So what actually happened was a research program, an action research program was created where the combination between military intelligence, anthropologists and designers in teams kind of studied the environment of conflict. And they started to design specific strategies that changed the way that conventional forces fought insurgents. You know, one of the most famous and one of the earliest examples was in Israel, where in an urban conflict, rather than walking down the street trying to kind of defend or hold space against insurgents, the armed forces, the conventional forces, knocked holes through the buildings and walked through the buildings and down the street. That was a result of a design decision. And that kind of activity kind of developed into getting cultural intelligence about the conduct of an adversary and using that cultural intelligence to actually design a strategy in terms of when and how, in what form to attack that enemy. So all of this is something that I've spent a reasonable amount of time looking at in my book called Unstaging War, that is really looking at not just the transformations of war, but how we need to think about war now and how we need to think about dealing with our inability to change in a war in a way which kind of responds to the world becoming more dangerous. Thank you. That's it.